I'm J.G. Michael, and this is Parallax Views. This edition of Parallax Views is brought to you by the $10 and above tier supporters of Parallax Views on Patreon. So, with that in mind, producers credit shoutouts to Galen, Matt, Gunnar, Mark, Simon, Alexander, Catherine, G, Tilo, Emilia, Jeremy, Jeff, John, Bert, Brian, Elliot, Michael, Brace, James, Nick, Mersham, Galen, Gareth, Arlen, Bo, Christopher, Michael, Gigadelic Media, Will, Chance, Chase, Dan, Big Bob, David H, Y. Kellerman, Sadeed 13, Kathleen, David, Ava, Bob, The West Bank Robbery Podcast, Jamie, Enoch, Gary, Max, Ishtofer, James, Martin, Matthew Ho, Brian, Nobody, Thomas, and Dano. And now on to the show. Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. As always, I want to remind you that if you appreciate the work here I do at Parallax Views, it would be great if you could support me on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. With that out of the way, on this edition of Parallax Views, who's funding the think tanks shaping U.S. policy, and how does that money influence what they say and do? Today, we'll be joined by Ben Freeman and Nick Cleveland-Stout of the Quincy Institute to talk about their think tank funding tracker, a tool that seeks to shine a light on the money behind DC's most powerful policy shops. We're talking defense contractors, foreign governments, the Pentagon, dark money, and why transparency matters more than ever for the future of think tanks. And now, with all that out of the way, let's get right to the conversation with Ben Freeman and Nick Cleveland-Stout of the Quincy Institute's Think Tank Funding Tracker. Welcome back to Parallax Views. Two guests I always enjoy having on the show, and they have a new project at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, the Think Tank Funding Tracker. We're going to be talking about that with the Quincy Institute's Ben Freeman and Nick Cleveland-Stout. How are you guys doing?
Doing well. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Ben, how are you?
I'm swell. Great to be back, JG.
So, Ben, I don't know if you want to go first here. Maybe you could explain exactly what the Think Tank Funding Tracker is, and just get one thing out of the way, because I know you probably get asked this in other interviews. Isn't Quincy itself a think tank? Which, yes, it is.
Yes, gotcha. The ultimate gotcha question of this project. Yeah, I think too. It's even I'd like to even start at a step even back from that, and that is, what the heck is a think tank? Frankly, the IRS doesn't know. There's no real formal legal definition of what a think tank is, and there's considerable debate about what it is. But effectively, a way for your listeners to think about it is that it's a nonprofit that is engaged in the policy space, be it through doing research or through policy advocacy. Think tanks have a view of the world, and they would like to translate that into policy. In a nutshell, there's a lot of varieties. We could certainly debate spin-offs of think tanks, but with that basic definition in mind, the other part of think tanks that I think is even less understood is how they keep the lights on. And like a lot of nonprofits, they rely on donations, and sometimes significant donations from a lot of folks that have a very vested interest in the policies that they're producing. And at the Quincy Institute, we're very concerned with foreign policy. So the genesis of this project was to take a look at how think tanks are keeping the lights on, who their funders are, and if those funders have any entanglements in the foreign policy space. So we look specifically at foreign governments, the defense contractors, Pentagon contractors, in the U.S. government itself, with a particular focus on Department of Defense funding of think tanks. And what we found from that was a lot, a significant amount of funding, around $1.5 billion going to just the nation's top 50 think tanks in the last 5 years. And, Nick really headed up a good chunk of this project. So I certainly defer to him on the details and the specifics of where we got that money, how we dug it up, and all that stuff.
Yeah, so just by the numbers, for each of the categories we looked at, we found $110 million coming from foreign governments to the top think tanks. We found $35 million coming from defense contractors to the top think tanks, and that's, the Lockheed Martins, the Northrop Grummans of the world. And then we found $1.5 billion coming from the US government to these think tanks. And most of that, I should say, went to one think tank, which is RAND, which has sort of been the Air Force's kind of personal think tank. So that's no real surprise. But one thing important to note on the numbers, and then we can dive deeper into some of these findings, is that, this is really just the tip of the iceberg in what we found. There are a number of issues in tracking think tank funding, which chief among them is that think tanks are actually not required to disclose a dime about who their funders are. And so actually over a third of the top think tanks that we looked at that are part of our database, which your listeners can check out if they're interested at thinktankfundingtracker.org, actually don't disclose anything. They're what we refer to as dark money think tanks. And a lot of these think tanks are ones that maybe not household names, but ones that your listeners are probably aware of, American Enterprise Institute, Washington Institute for Near East Policy. So these think tanks are also, testifying to Congress, helping write legislation, very much enmeshed in the policy debate, but don't disclose anything about their funding sources. And even amongst the transparent think tanks, there are ways in which they can hide some of their funding sources, taking anonymous donors. They'll also put funding into specific ranges, things like that, which sometimes isn't the most helpful. If a think tank is saying that their highest donor is like 100,000 plus per year, but their annual revenue is like 100 million, that's kind of a drop in the bucket. So because we take the low end of all that, we can definitively say, all the numbers in our database are really just on the low end of what these donors are giving to these think tanks.
One thing I wanted to get into, and it's more a bigger picture issue here, but I think think tanks are important. They do serve a function in the Beltway and in our political system. And I don't think this think tank funding tracker is like an attack on think tanks even. Why is this tracker important for think tanks? Because I know that the Quincy brief on this had recommendations for think tanks. Why should think tanks be concerned with their funding, or at least with the issue of transparency?
Yeah, this was an issue that actually it was one of the things that led us to start this project. As you mentioned, JG, we work at the Quincy Institute. The Quincy Institute is a think tank. So if we were going to say think tanks were evil, then we'd have to put ourselves in that category because we work at think tanks too. We had discovered that public trust in think tanks had frankly plummeted. And this is part of a decline in the general distrust of expertise in the US and around the world. And, we saw some polling that said that think tanks were suffering from this crisis of public confidence. But the public just didn't trust think tank experts, thought they had hidden agendas specifically. And so what we view that as a problem, because I think we, like you, we think think tanks are valuable. And we do think that there's an important place to play for think tanks in the US, and they can do really good work doing wonderful research, converting that into policies that will benefit a lot of folks in the US and around the world. So we're a fan of think tanks. So, we started this project accordingly. And part of what we want to do with the tracker was to increase the transparency of think tanks, so increase that funding transparency, which survey respondents said they were concerned about because the think tanks weren't doing it themselves. And so we wanted to make a publicly searchable database, again, as Nick said, available at thinktankfundingtracker.org, where if you're a member of the public, you think there's some hidden agenda, go check it out. Look up the think tank on our website. See who's funding them. You can find out if there's any of those issues going on there too. But that's why it did concern us that so many of the think tanks, more than a third, as Nick mentioned, don't disclose anything. And this gets to our recommendations. We would love for this to start something of a virtuous cycle where those think tanks who, we want to name them, and we do want to throw some shame on them for not disclosing anything. We think disclosure and transparency is important. So we'd love to start a virtuous cycle where think tanks, they get concerned about it and they get competitive about their transparency. They want to transparency of the next organization. So this is also why we created a rating system for think tank transparency. We got a 5-star system. A lot of I feel like these days you have to have a 5-star system, right? To rate things. So we do too, and we put the Quincy Institute in there too. And Quincy Institute did not get a perfect rating, and it's something we're working to improve next year. We're trying to bump up to a 5-star rating ourselves.
Yeah, I was gonna say you guys are really you put I think Stimson Center and the Bergeron Center as the top transparency scores.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, the Quincy Institute, I will say to your listeners, it's incredibly transparent. The one thing we didn't do to get to that 5-star rating is we don't list the exact dollar amount of contributions. And so the Simpson Center, they're just phenomenal. Every contribution that they're getting, they're put, down to, if it's $10,000 and or $10,073, they're putting that 73 in there. So you know exactly what's going on. It's just an immaculate level of transparency. We're trying to get there, and we hope some of these dark money think tanks and some of these think tanks with these lower star ratings, we hope that in future years they kind of climb up that transparency ladder too. Because we've made it very clear this is an ongoing project for us. We've gotten a lot of just wonderful support for this project. So we're going to keep updating it every single year, and we hope that every year we do it, we see a little more transparency coming out of think tanks.
Do you want to talk a little bit about who are the lowest scoring with regards to transparency? I know AEI comes up. There's actually a pretty decent number that are getting a 0 on the transparency score, which it's a problem. Yeah.
It's a pretty impressive 18-way tie. You have in a lot of them, I think some of the biggest names will be, American Enterprise Institute, Cato Institute, Foundation for Defense of Democracies, Third Way, Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Most of these think tanks, they tend to lean center right, but I think importantly, for our purposes, they also tend to be some of the more hawkish think tanks in Washington. These something that I've been tracking is which think tanks are testifying the most to Congress, and there's a number of think tanks on this list. Washington Institute for Near East Policy, FDD, that are constantly, appearing before the House Foreign Affairs Committee and advising on policy that pertains to potentially, we don't know, the interests of people that might be funding them. And so, there in some cases you can kind of read the tea leaves and see what kind of analysis they're putting out and take an educated guess. Sometimes they'll even let slip who some of their funders are. AEI has accidentally kind of mentioned that they're funded by Lockheed Martin and Northrop Grumman, which isn't, if you've been on AEI's homepage, it's not the most surprising scoop. But at the same time, because we don't know the degree of funding that they're getting from these sources and, the full list of donors, it should, I think, raise some eyebrows that these think tanks are still seen as these prestigious, houses for experts that are testifying and making legislation.
One think tank that comes up a lot in this tracker is the Atlantic Council. So for my listeners, maybe you could explain what the Atlantic Council is and why they come up so much in the tracker. They're a very influential think tank too, I should note.
They are, yeah, they're one of the biggest think tanks in Washington. I think, as the name suggests, it's this think tank that was kind of born out of the really to support NATO, the transatlantic relationship. But since then, it's grown exponentially. It has an annual revenue of upwards of 60 million, which makes it one of the largest think tanks in DC. And it's one of these think tanks that's really embraced this new funding model of going not towards just foundations and U.S. government, but corporations and foreign governments. It comes out as number one in having received the most defense contractor donations and the most foreign government contributions. Some of its largest funders include the United Arab Emirates and Northrop Grumman. And part of the reason that I think we talk a decent amount about the Atlantic Council is they will not shy away from talking about issues that pertain to their funders. And you do have to commend them on their degree of transparency, but at the same time, they will constantly, they had a series of articles last year, for example, where they're talking about why Congress needs to save the Sentinel program, which is, this new ICBM program from Northrop Grumman. And it's just a sort of a blatant conflict of interest that they will really like make pretty stark recommendations in favor of these funders in their policy analysis, while simultaneously claiming that they are independent, that their funding doesn't have any impact on the recommendations that they make, which is sort of dubious. And I think the clearest example that I've seen of that was actually from a commission that they put together just a couple of weeks ago. At the end, they had this commission. It was called on software-based warfare. It was an 18-month project where they got a bunch of defense contractors together. It was this big collaboration where they basically proposed a series of recommendations on slashing red tape on defense acquisition, a number of things that reasonable people can debate on. But at the end of this launch event for this commission, they literally say, by the way, if you want to look to invest in some companies, here's a list of our sponsors, which and among them is like Lockheed Martin and a bunch of companies that fund the Atlantic Council. So when you look at things like that, even giving financial advice for investment almost, then it becomes the claim that the analysis that they produce, the recommendations that they make is independent, becomes a little bit more dubious.
I'd say the other thing about the Atlantic Council too is this is very much Nick's point. But by the way, that story he just mentioned is in a wonderful article that he just penned with Julia Gledhill in Responsible Statecraft too. So your listeners can get the whole story there. And the other thing about the Atlantic Council too is they don't shy away from what donors can get by working with the Atlantic Council and donating with them. It's right on their website. You can look it up if you want to see what you can how you can possibly benefit as a donor from the Atlantic Council. It's right on the website. You want to have one-on-ones with different experts at the Atlantic Council. Contribute enough and you can. You want to have these salon type dinners with some of the staff. Donate enough and you can. You want to have a dedicated person on staff to work directly with you. You donate enough and you can. It's all right there on the website. They're not hiding it. This is not us. We're not conspiracy theorists. At the end of the day, we're research nerds. And so that they're putting all this information out there. What we do know from some more investigative reporting related to the Atlantic Council of instances, through leaked emails and other things, The Intercept and other outlets have put out pieces about them where you learn that donors get to directly look at research products before they're published and provide comments and provide feedback. And, that in some cases that goes back directly to the authors of those reports. Does it mean the authors are going to change the work? No, not necessarily. But if I will tell you, somebody who works at a think tank, if I know that a donor is reading my work and has problems with it or has some suggestions for it, that might change the way that I do business. Even if it doesn't make me change the way I do that report, that certainly might be in my head the next time I write about anything related to that donor. And so this is another mechanism we know from the academic research around think tank funding, that a big part of why think tank funding matters is because of self-censorship. If you know you work at a think tank and you know that you have a big funder who's connected to a particular program, a particular thing, you are just going to be less likely to say bad things about that. And if you want to prove me wrong, think tankers out there, do it, give it a try. Write a bunch of things that are really disrespectful about your think tank's top funder, and let's see how long you're able to keep that funder.
Let's talk about the top foreign government donors to think tanks. And this is covering, I believe, 2019 to 2023. The two biggest ones are the UAE and I believe the United Kingdom, then followed by Qatar. A lot of these are allies of the US, some more democratic than others, some more authoritarian. What do you want people to get out of the analysis of the top foreign government donors to think tanks? Do you want to take that, Nick, or Ben, you can as well?
Yeah, I think for the foreign government donors, you can broadly group them into two categories. I think on the one hand, you have a lot of, as you mentioned, NATO allies, NATO treaty allies. These donors will, their interests are in trying to drum up U.S. support for European defense. This is actually something that, in some cases, like donors, there was a New York Times investigation into foreign government think tank funding about a decade ago now. It was kind of the first of its kind. And it found that, sorry?
2014.
2014. And it found that Norway, in which is a big donor, European country, big donor, they have their own interests, but, they literally said in one of their internal reports that they were funding think tanks as a way to influence policy in Washington. It wasn't simply to outsource research. In some cases, donors might need that capacity, but a lot of times donors will be giving money for simply to influence the debate. So you have the NATO allies and European countries on one side, and then you have, I think the other category that you can look to are the Middle Eastern monarchies. These are oil-rich countries in the Middle East. They have their own interests, that include arms sales, that might include, depending on the day, drumming up support for a war in Yemen or with Iran, or getting U.S. soldiers stationed in the Middle East, all sorts of interests. But that list includes, as you mentioned, the UAE. Qatar is pretty high on the list. Saudi Arabia is also fairly high on the list. And so those are kind of the two broad categories that you can look at. And the UAE, I'll just highlight the UAE.
I was gonna say real quick, it's crazy. They're far and ahead of all the other Middle Eastern countries. I think they're almost double that of Qatar even. So
yeah, and what's interesting about the UAE also is that it is the one I think that we know the most about what they are trying to get out of think tank funding. As Ben mentioned earlier, like there was this tranche of leaked emails with the UAE. They were, one thing that sticks out in my mind is like they funded a study through the Center for New American Security, which is kind of one of these, center left national security establishment type think tanks run by Michelle Flournoy, who's just a mainstay in the Democratic national security establishment. And there were several emails between her and Yusuf Al-Otaiba, the Emirati ambassador, in which they basically cooked up this plan to write a report that would essentially make the argument that the U.S. should ease regulations on drone exports, $250,000 study. And sure enough, they understood the assignment. It came out. It was funded entirely by the UAE. It comes out and it even mentions like the UAE as a potential recipient of drone export technology. And so, with a lot of these countries, because there is such a lack of transparency, we don't totally know, what their interests are. It's also entirely possible that a lot of these donors will not, they'll take their foot off the gas, so to speak, in terms of pushing sort of direct censorship on what they want to see, this kind of like what we've called pay-to-play research. Some donors might simply donate because they understand that there is a degree of self-censorship that takes place, as we've heard in some cases. But yeah, those are the two kind of main categories that I think you can lump the foreign government donors into.
I mean, we've heard too that, with countries like the UAE and others, so, since we put out this report, and Nick and I have separately been writing about think tank funding for a while now. Our colleague Eli Clifton too does some wonderful work on think tank funding as well. And what we've known and learned over the years, folks at these other think tanks talk to us, and a lot of times we get something to the effect of like, "Oh my God, it's so much worse than than you even wrote here." Let me tell you more, and they kind of we'll let them take us behind the curtain at some of these other think tanks, and we hear stories of folks saying that they're not allowed to produce certain research because of a specific funder. It could jeopardize that funding. I heard from an individual who was funded by one of these authoritarian friends of the U.S., and they were asked in their annual review why they hadn't written anything critical about that regime's opponent in the Middle East. So there's even this sort of, there's like this active tit for tat. Yeah, we also know too that there are sometimes in these donations, they come with caveats in them that you are not allowed to take money from a rival government. If you accept our donation, you can't accept money from a rival government. And so, we know we even as much as detailed as our report is and the think tank tracker is, we hear these other stories too. We left the vast majority of them out because, in some cases it's hearsay if we can't verify it. But we know the effect of money on think tanks is so unbelievably pervasive. And another, I think, very critical point about foreign governments, why foreign governments fund think tanks, it's a part of their larger influence operations. And, we see this directly. Nick and I spend a lot of our time combing over Foreign Agents Registration Act, FARA filings. And we see in those filings all the time, they're reaching out to think tanks, they're talking with experts at think tanks. And a lot of times those are think tanks that they fund. And so that's the reason why these lobbyists and these PR folks have access to these think tanks, because the country who's paying them is also paying this think tank. So they all come together and kind of form this perfect storm. So at the end of the day, from a lobbyist point of view, it's a lot more powerful if they can circulate an article written by a think tank expert than it is if they, John Q. lobbyists, just send out talking points themselves. So in a sense, think tanks can kind of serve in the influence sphere. They can kind of serve as kind of messaging laundering, where the public might be receiving this message and have no idea that it's coming from somebody who's paid by the UAE, who's paid by the Qataris, who's paid by the Saudis. And so for us is an area we think is particularly problematic, and this is again why we really push for transparency of think tank funding. So one thing, if you're going to say that, the very least you can do is, if you're going to write that article about somebody who funds you, please, by God, put that caveat at the bottom of that article. Let readers know.
I hope this isn't too outside the bounds of the conversation, but I think there will be listeners that get the impression, well, there just should be no foreign government involvement with think tanks. And I'm not sure that's what you guys are saying either. Are there pros and cons to the foreign government funding?
I think there are, and I think part of it is foreign governments will fund think tanks for a lot of the same reasons that they'll hire lobbyists and PR firms. And this is what I always tell people, like, people always ask, well, why doesn't France spend more money? Why doesn't Germany spend, or Spain? Why don't some of our allies spend as much money as the Saudis and the Emiratis, the Qataris do? And, my simple answer is they don't have to, because their interests are already very much in line with ours. And, or at least they were before this administration, maybe, might have to caveat the statement. But when your interests align as a foreign country, you don't have to do as much outside of your embassy. If you have a capable ambassador, capable diplomats here in the U.S., they can get a lot done for you. When you don't have that, when you're an authoritarian regime that has these issues with human rights, if you're the UAE and you're funding this rebel force in Sudan that's helping to fuel this genocide there, like, yeah, you've got a lot of PR to do. If you're the Saudis and you're murdering journalists on foreign soil with bone saws, yeah, you're gonna have to hire some lobbyists and PR folks to spin your image. And I think it's the same thing too with think tanks. That's why they turn to think tanks. All of that said, I've had conversations with folks at sort of NATO allies, other democracies, and I've actually encouraged them to donate to think tanks. And, because they make these complaints, we're not getting our voices heard, we're not getting out there. And, I'll tell them flat out, make a donation to a think tank, form those collaborations, because at the very least, that helps them make their case in DC. And, it might give them a platform to to get their voices heard, to get to speak, to get to inform the research that think tanks are doing. So I think it's good to have a conversation back and forth. I'm not a fan of abolishing, think tank funding really from just about anyone. And I certainly think there's more space for particularly U.S. allies to donate more to U.S. think tanks.
I want to get this out of the way because I know it's like a sidebar and there's a reason for it. But I'm going to have listeners that say, well, you didn't mention AIPAC or you didn't mention the Israel lobby. And there's a reason for that. And it has to do with, I mean, AIPAC is ultimately an American, I mean, it's in the name, American Israel Public Affairs Committee. So do you want to talk about that? Because I know someone's going to bring it up.
Yeah, sure. Nick?
Yes. No, as you said, yeah, it's just as Ben was saying about, Spain and France, why maybe they don't fund think tanks. Israel doesn't have to. Israel doesn't really appear in our database because there are a lot of groups in the US that fund that fund think tanks that tend to be pro-Israel. A lot of them, some of them are also, dark money. Washington Institute for Near East Policy, for instance, FDD, they tend to be very pro-Israel, but we don't, entirely know where their funding comes from. But yeah, AIPAC, for instance, was not in our database because it's not the standard that we use was that it had to be majority owned by a foreign government, and AIPAC and other groups don't meet that definition. And so for that simple reason, it's not in our database.
I mean, it's as you said, JG. It's, the thing with AIPAC is, and I think, a lot of people skip right over this when it comes to AIPAC. It's A. The first letter is A for a reason. And I have talked to folks at AIPAC who say that is not an accident. It is not IAPAC. It is the American Israeli Public Affairs Committee, and that the fundraising comes from Americans to fund AIPAC. And until that changes by the letter of the law, then that means that AIPAC, they're not a foreign government, certainly by our definition. And they're also not registered under FARA. They're not registered under the Foreign Agents Registration Act. Because, if you're funded by Americans, AIPAC is run largely by American citizens too. And so they don't check any of the boxes for FARA registration either. And so, they don't check the FARA boxes, and they didn't check the boxes for us to qualify as a foreign government in our space. All that said, it's the impact of AIPAC on the think tank space, unquestionable. AIPAC has enormous influence at think tanks.
Well, yeah, what I was going to say, not to interrupt you, is I think looking at AIPAC would be a good research project for another group or another group of researchers. It just doesn't necessarily fit the scope of what you're doing.
Right. And I would say I would encourage your listeners to again take a look at our colleague Eli Clifton's work on this. He has done just some phenomenal digging into AIPAC funding. And he recently had a piece about Miriam Adelson that appeared in Responsible Statecraft too, that I would encourage listeners to take a look at. The Adelson, Fox News, Empire there, and the causes she's fund. She's very closely connected to the Israel lobby as well. Yeah, Eli's done some phenomenal work on it. Folks at the Intercept too have done some really good. Ryan Grimm and others at Drop Site News now have done some really good work on AIPAC's influence. And it's a wonderful pool. It just was not in the scope of our analysis for this project.
Also note that Israel actually did consider basically creating its own kind of new think tank. There was some reporting out of The Guardian last year that Israel was very seriously considering funding a US-based think tank, but it ended up not doing that because it was worried that it would have to register under the Foreign Agents Registration Act.
I want to go into the defense contractors, but before we even go there, let's go into the U.S. government donors to think tanks. And far above them all is the U.S. Department of Defense.
Shocker.
Look at that.
Yeah, I mean, with the Department of Defense, I think when we went into this project, we sort of knew that this was going to happen. Because we know the amount of money that the Department of Defense spends just on RAND. Every year the Department of Defense is dumping literally hundreds of millions of dollars into RAND. And RAND for your listeners to know, RAND is this. It's a very, very unique entity, and it's what's known as a federally funded research center, FFRC, and it's been loosely called the Department of Defense's think tank. It's sort of spawned out of working with being the sort of research nerds for the Department of Defense. And so,
Yeah,
it has
they
this.
played a big role in informing, the Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, during the Vietnam War. They were like the whiz kids at the Rand Corporation.
That's right. That's right. Which, I guess in hindsight, if you're the whiz kids of the Vietnam War, maybe not so good. But all jokes aside, the Rand Corporation was very kind of anomalous in some ways, but we felt it was important to have Rand included in here. Because Rand also, in addition to doing this, a lot of the research that they do is just private, privately, goes to DoD, informs decision making within the building. That's all well and good, but some of it does reach the public eye, and it's not unheard of to hear somebody from Rand testifying before Congress, somebody from Rand quoted in New York Times, Washington Post, major media outlets too. So, you have all this money coming from DoD to Rand, and you have all this Rand expertise making its way into the public policy discourse. So we wanted to make sure, we wanted to include it in the database and make sure that everybody knew that that was going on too.
Do you want to add to that at all, Nick, or?
Yeah, sure. I think with US government funding, I mean, there's two kind of groups that you can lump the recipients of that funding. First, there's the FFRDCs, the Federally Funded Research and Development Centers that, chief among them RAND, which you guys are just talking about, which is kind of, real, like they were the engines in some ways behind the Cold War. And a lot of them, still exist today. They peaked in the 50s and 60s, but Rand is still around today, still putting out a lot of mostly nowadays public studies. During the Cold War was much more classified. But then on the other hand, you still have like the think tanks that we were talking about earlier in this discussion that are receiving quite a bit of US government funding themselves. Not nearly as much as the FFRDCs, but you do have like the Atlantic Council, Center for Strategic and International Studies, which is another massive think tank. A lot of these kind of like DC think tanks that receive a lot of funding from foreign governments, defense contractors, that also take a pretty significant chunk from the Department of Defense. And I think in some cases it's think tanks, these sorts of think tanks, they become such a confluence for different funders, right? And I think in some cases it's worth wondering whether which of these interests, these really competing interests, are kind of winning out at a certain think tank. Like one thing that I noticed, for example, is CSIS, which I just mentioned. It got like hundreds of thousands of dollars to do a study. I think this was a year or two ago. From
This
the
is
office.
the Center for Strategic and International Studies, right?
Yes. Yes, which is the think tank that testifies the most, more than any other think tank, the most to the House Foreign Affairs Committee. They are really enmeshed in the policy debates of the day, and they've succeeded at that in today like more than any other think tank. So they received a few $100,000 from the Office of Net Assessment, which Trump has now disbanded, to study like what Saudi policy should be. And the only problem with that is that it's a little bit tricky to outsource that sort of research to a think tank like CSIS, because CSIS also takes a lot of Saudi funding. So you have on the one hand, there's an argument to be made of like these people have a lot of connections to Saudi Arabia. Maybe they have an understanding of it in a way that other researchers might not. But at the same time, like, how can you entirely trust that the analysis that's coming out of that when it's taking so much funding from Saudi Arabia? How can they be entirely objective in that output? So those are kind of the two main groups that you can lump them in. And Trump has taken issue with some think tank funding. Like we've seen him shutter the Wilson Center, for example, which has been kind of a mainstay for these sort of centrist internationalist think tanks. President Wilson was kind of the OG internationalist, as the name would suggest. And so that's Wilson Center has kind of been shuttered, the U.S. Institute for Peace as well. And so Trump has kind of taken an issue with U.S. government funding of some of these think tanks based here in D.C. Even Rand, if you go to Rand's homepage, the first thing that pops up before anything else is like an open letter to the U.S. government. It was published in January, basically saying, please do not cut our funding. Here is a number of things that Rand has done, trying to sort of get ahead of the curve. And we haven't really seen Rand pop up in some of these debates around U.S. government funding of think tanks, but it certainly could, the way that the past 4 months have gone.
You mentioned earlier that maybe some think tanks have sort of peaked in the Cold War era. That gets into something I wanted to talk about because I'm not sort of on the inside of this. What are the most influential or relevant think tanks? Because your comment reminded me of, well, is something like the CFR as relevant today as it was during the Cold War? And I sort of try to wonder sometimes about, well, which ones are the most important? Like if there were a top three or four.
I mean, I'll start by saying that measuring policy impact is something that think tanks are, we work at a think tank. Like it's something that is always up for discussion, and you're always trying to demonstrate what sort of policy impact you're making. So measuring the most influential can be a little bit tricky, but there have been groups that have tried to compile lists. I think Academic Influence is the group that has done that most recently. And some of the think tanks that, if I were to just name three or four that I think would be the top of that list, and Ben, feel free to jump in here as well. I would say Brookings, the Brookings Institution. That's been around for 100 years at this point. You have Council on Foreign Relations, which you mentioned. They publish Foreign Affairs, which, for better or for worse, to this day and age, is I would probably the most prestigious or influential foreign policy oriented magazine. And then I would add Center for Strategic and International Studies for their closeness to the policy debate. And I think, a few months ago, maybe I would have said something different, but I think because of the Trump administration, you have to have Heritage on the list. Heritage, more than any other right-leaning think tank, has shored up its ties to the current administration. It's best positioned to make inroads in some of the policy goals that it's enmeshed itself into the last 40 years or so in its existence. Heritage was born out of the 1970s. In 1981, President Ronald Reagan handed out copies of Heritage's mandate for leadership, which is sort of the blueprint for what it wanted the Reagan administration to do. And Project 2025 was sort of trying to recreate that and to kind of mix success, right? So I think Heritage, there's certainly a case for it to be made that Heritage is the most influential think tank right now because of the Trump administration. But Ben, do you have any others you would add?
I mean, obviously the Quincy Institute, clear number one, well above any of all those combined that Nick said.
Agreed.
No, it's funny when Nick did such a good job of putting all those think tanks in context, with a think tank like the Quincy Institute, we're barely 5 years old. And so, we're the David versus a lot of these, Goliath think tanks. And, or as I like to say, we're throwing rocks in a town filled with glass houses. But they're all much bigger than us, and the size does correlate with influence in some cases. And I think that the list Nick provided was spot on. I would just say it would be hard for me to buy an argument that heritage wasn't the most influential right now. You look at Project 2025, a lot of those proposals are already being adopted. You look at another big metric with administrations is where are the people that are filling that administration coming from? Again, it's heritage is just far and away. Former heritage staffers are filling the Trump administration in droves. There, people who wrote Project 2025 are implementing Project 2025 on the inside. It's hard to find more direct impact than that right now.
With regards to the Heritage Foundation, then, I think a lot of people will focus on the Heritage Foundation's policies for just the U.S., like the domestic scene. But I believe they have foreign policy goals as well. And I mean, I know they have a foreign policy section on their website. Do you think that's important to note?
I do, and I think that it actually reflects kind of what we've seen from the Trump administration so far, because the Project 2025 recommendations for foreign policy are such a mixed bag. Like depending on which page you read, they might be advocating for doubling the Pentagon budget, or they might be advocating for the U.S. Retreating from some of its formal alliances. Like there's a number of kind of mixed messages that you get, whether it's like the Iron Dome for America idea or, changing support for U.S. for Ukraine in their war with Russia. There's a number of things that just like are not entirely consistent. And I think that that's actually reflected in what we've seen from the Trump administration so far. I mean, in the last 4 months, we've seen a lot of infighting in the Trump administration's foreign policy team. The knives are clearly out. The crowd that, might identify as more either restrainers or prioritizers, people that are in favor of the U.S. decreasing its worldwide commitments, have kind of gone to bat with some of the neoconservatives, some of the more hawkish mainstays in Republican politics, which there are still some, even looking at personnel picks, right? Like you have Marco Rubio, who has historically been quite hawkish, or someone else. But then you also have like Rick Grinnell, who has entirely different views, and they're both working on Latin America, right? And so how do you have those two simultaneously? Well, I think the Project 2025 kind of gave a sneak peek for what to expect, and I think that that's reflected in what we've seen so far.
And I think what they did with Project 2025 and what Heritage does sort of writ large is they're a reflection of where the conservative movement is at any point in time. And right now, the Republicans and the conservative movement is at a really interesting inflection point when it comes to foreign policy. Historically, you had this sort of old guard, war hawkish, neocon Republican Party where you knew exactly what to expect if you had a Republican appointee to a position. It was going to be a hawkish foreign policy stance. It was very pro-military. And now you're getting much more of a mixed bag. Heritage started this a few years ago, actually. I reached out to Heritage for comment on a previous piece I had written on think tank funding, and I was asking about defense contractor funding, and they said, Ben, we actually just stopped. We established a policy to stop accepting defense contractor funding because we don't want even the perception that it's influencing our work going forward. Now, if you had told me that like 5 years ago that Heritage was going to do that, I wouldn't have believed you. Because Heritage has been a staunch, hawkish think tank up to that point. But Heritage is caught in the middle of the shift right now in the Republican Party, where you still have some of those hawks, but you have more of this war-weary Republican base who's not interested in getting in foreign wars, certainly wants to pull the U.S. far away from Ukraine, and is really not interested in putting U.S. boots on the ground anywhere. So you're seeing that friction play out at Heritage, Project 2025, and in this Trump administration too.
Before we close out, let's end on the top Pentagon contractor donors to think tanks. Far and above, the biggest one is Northrop Grumman, followed by Lockheed Martin. Anything else we should add about the Pentagon contractor donors?
I mean, I think this is it's a perfect example of whether you want to call it, it's a self-fulfilling ecosystem, a self-licking ice cream cone. There's all tons of weird metaphors that we use to describe the system. But, these are companies at the end of the day. These are if you look at our report, the biggest donors to think tanks, correlate just about perfectly with the largest recipients of defense contractor money that they get, taxpayer money that they get via Pentagon contracts. So, they're getting billions of dollars a year in those Pentagon contracts. For most of these companies, a majority of their revenue is coming from the Pentagon, is coming via taxpayer dollars. And then they use a huge chunk of that money to then try and shape the policy ecosystem, shape the policy space. They hire lobbyists like crazy. They have almost 1,000 defense Pentagon contractors have almost 1,000 lobbyists on their payroll right now. It's almost 2 for every member of Congress. Spend over $100 million every year on lobbying. And then they spend millions of dollars too on think tanks. And again, this is very similar, I think, to think about this in the way that people should think about why foreign governments are funding think tanks. It's part of an influence drive. Defense contractors are those think tanks that are funded by defense contractors. They're working with those lobbyists. In some cases, they're writing the research and reports that those lobbyists are then sending out to congressional offices on the Hill. They're helping to write legislation in some cases. And so, when you're looking at those defense contractor dollars, you have to look at it as part of this ecosystem where your taxpayer dollars are going to fund these companies, and those companies are then using that money to fund an influence operation that's trying to get more and more taxpayer dollars every year. And the bad news I have for your listeners is they're winning. They are getting more and more taxpayer dollars every year, and we are seeing them donate more and more to think tanks, more and more to lobbying and PR firms too, more and more in campaign contributions. The system, it is circular and it's winning for them, certainly not for the American people.
Do you think, go ahead, Nick, and then
I was going to say Ben gets fired up about this because he is in the midst of, he's writing a book. It's coming out later this year, available for pre-order. I'll plug
$1 Billion War Machine, available where good books and in my book are sold.
Did you want to add anything, Nick, or?
I think one thing I'll note on the Pentagon contractors that is sort of unique to them as well is there is this, a lot of think tank experts will have this, they'll sort of have these like dueling hats. They will simultaneously be an expert at a think tank, and they will also work for the defense industry. Like that is not uncommon at all. And I think and that's common also with board members at think tanks. You have like James Teislett. He's on the board of directors for the Council on Foreign Relations, but he's also the CEO of Lockheed Martin, the largest defense contractor. And so I think that is, they sort of treat it as though these are identities that you can just, take on and off. Oh, now I'm in my capacity as a policy expert, and oh, now I'm trying to deliver for shareholders at my defense company. So I think that's something that is worth calling attention to with regards to the defense contractors.
Last thing here, and you can tell me if I'm off base. I sometimes feel as if the defense contractor part of all of this is actually kind of sorely overlooked compared to foreign funding or U.S. government funding. Am I off base, or am I correct in saying that maybe sometimes people overlook the role of the defense contractors?
No, I completely agree. I completely agree. I think, especially because with the defense contractor funding, like you can kind of trace recommendations that are sympathetic to their donors because they will, make recommendations that like literally list out specific weapons types that a certain company will make. Like that's something that we see time and time again. I was tracking kind of what think tanks were putting out with regards to Trump winning the election. He's entering office. A lot of them kind of put out again, kind of following Heritage's lead, like they all kind of put out like a list of things that they wanted the Trump administration to do, kind of taking after Project 2025 with their own sort of mini versions of that. And time again, you see think tanks say, here's what we want Trump to do on Ukraine. Here's what we want to see Trump do on Taiwan. And they will literally list like weapon systems that are produced by their donors, whether they're F-16s, whether they're ATACMS, all kinds of different things that clearly represent a conflict of interest. So I think in those cases, like you can draw that line from funding to like sympathetic policy recommendations being made. And just to like illustrate the return on investment that some of these defense contractors might be getting, if the Trump administration or whoever's in charge were to like accept one of these recommendations being made. I mean, an F-16 costs how many millions of dollars? Maybe 60, $70 million in some cases. Whereas these think tanks, they're the donors, like they're donating a couple million over the last 5 years, right? Northrop Grumman gave 5 million, Lockheed Martin, 2.5 million, I think. So if Trump were to say, oh, okay, here's this expert from the Atlantic Council saying send another F-16 to Ukraine, even just one, that's another 60 million for the donor. So the ROI is just ridiculous. If anyone's looking to buy influence on the cheap, think tanks are certainly the way to go.
I think I'll add to that, and I'll spoil our book a little bit. In Trillion Dollar War Machine, we explicitly make the argument that think tanks are part of the military-industrial complex. And if you talk to folks in the peace movement, the progressive movement, they've been sort of calling out Congress's role in the military-industrial complex, the military-industrial congressional complex, people would say. But our argument is that it's so much bigger than that now. In one of the big areas where the military industrial complex's influence has really grown is in this think tank space. When you have think tanks that are just, writing things that, I mean, look a lot like an infomercial, produced by the defense contractor itself. And, the recommendations are just brazenly saying, buy more of this thing that is made by somebody who funds our organization. And then they don't disclose that too on top of it. You could really see, again, a closed loop of influence here where, you're doing exactly the bidding that this defense contractor wants you to do. And you're also doing work that looks a lot like the same stuff that defense contractors, lobbyists, and PR folks are doing. So I think in 2025, you have to look at think tanks as really a key part of the defense industry's influence in DC.
In closing, what do you both want my listeners to get out of this conversation we've been having about the think tank funding tracker at Quincy Institute? Do you want to go first, Ben?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would hope people, number one, please use the website. We made it, intentionally very user friendly. So whenever you're listening to the radio, you're watching TV, you're reading an article, and you see a name in there, you hear one of these think tank names. Go and take a look. A quick click over to our website. You can look up, what their funding profile looks like.
Real quick, not to interrupt you, but the website is thinktankfundingtracker.org.
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah, just click over there. Take a brief pause from your article, take a look at the funding sources behind that person, and then I think that helps to put articles in context for your listeners. And we're working directly with journalists now too to try and get them to do that themselves. For the journalists who are writing these pieces to put that in the article that hey, this source I'm talking to might have a conflict of interest here to put in the article. But for your listeners. Please use the website. It's there. We wanted to make it easy for folks exactly like you to use to discover these conflicts of interest yourself.
And Nick, do you want to make a closing comment?
I'll just add to that. Check out the Quincy Institute. We don't take defense contractor funding or foreign government funding. No, I think yeah, as Ben said, I think you I think that and I think your listeners will be well aware of this, but a lot of people, they'll turn on the TV, they'll see a think tank expert, you'll read an article, you'll see a think tank expert quoted, or turn on C-SPAN, whatever. Think tanks, they're kind of everywhere. Like you don't really realize that until someone tells you, and you're like, okay, wait, they have these very prestigious sounding names. And they're kind of everywhere. But I think a lot of people don't understand the conflicts of interest that might be at play. So I think I would just encourage your listeners to next time they turn on the TV or read an article, kind of deliberately like look for these, and maybe go check out our website and see if any of your suspicions are true. And lastly, send us tips. We always want to learn more about think tank funding. So I have an email in my Twitter bio. So please send me anything that you find, anything interesting that stands out to you regarding think tanks, where they get their funding, and conflicts of interest at play. So yeah, thanks so much for this conversation.
And thank both of you for coming back on Parallax Views, Ben Freeman and Nick Cleveland-Stout. It's always a pleasure to have you on, and I hope people will check out the Think Tank Funding Tracker and keep up with your work at the Quincy Institute. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Well, that does it for this edition of Parallax Views. As always, please consider supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. And with that being said, until next time, you've been listening to Parallax Views with Parallax Views to Parallax Views with Parallax Views.
The way out is not simply to say, don't do it, just to prohibit. It's nothing else. If we don't do it, others will be doing it like crazy. So, we have to confront the problem. But no, basically, I know of the great anxieties, problems, new forms of control, but it's also new forms of freedom. This is why I always emphasize that internet and all this new digital stuff, it's a very ambiguous phenomenon, but it's the field of struggle. New forms of enslavement, but at the same time, new incredible forms of freedom. We have to accept the fight with no nostalgia for old, allegedly more authentic communities or whatever. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid.